Welcome to Beginning Watercolor. In this session, we're going to be talking about all the different supplies that I would recommend for a successful watercolor endeavor here. We're going to talk about the paper and the brushes and the paint, and we're also going to, I'm going to demonstrate how to use those supplies. So, well, that's what we'll be doing the whole course, but a little bit more specifically, how to hold the brush, how to apply it, how much water to use, that type of thing. So let's get started on looking at the different supplies that you'll use in this beginning watercolor class. Let's take a look at the supplies that I use when I paint with watercolors. My first recommendation for you is that you invest in some excellent watercolor paper. It's really easy to pick up the less expensive paper and purchase that, but you will have disappointing results and you'll get frustrated. So this is the paper that I recommend. It's the gold standard. It's Arches watercolor paper. Now it comes in different finishes. I use cold pressed paper, but some watercolor artists use hot press paper. It's got to do with well, just the finish of it. So hot press paper is a flatter surface, whereas a cold press has a little more texture to it. The weight of the paper is 140 pounds. The other really important thing to look at when you're purchasing paper is to make sure that you're buying 100% pure cotton paper. So you might find other brands, but if you see that it's 140 pound, 100% cotton, then that's going to be a pretty good paper. So first of all, Arches, an excellent brand. It's really the gold standard. The other brands that I paint on often is this Hahnemuhle. It's a German paper, but it's 100% cotton, and it is 140 pound, and it is cold pressed. Try to see where that is listed. I can't see it right down here. Yeah, so it's cold pressed paper. Yeah, so this is an excellent paper. And then lastly, I do like to paint on Kilimanjaro paper. And this also is 140 pound, cold pressed, 100% pure cotton. And this one is a block. I love painting on a block of paper. So on a block, the pages are sealed all the way around with a small opening at the top. And that way your paper is held down tightly as you paint. And then when you're done, you insert something and take off the paper from the pad. It's an excellent way to paint. So those are the three papers I would recommend. The Arches is number one. And Hahnemuhle and the Kilimanjaro, those are all excellent brands, like I said. Next, let's talk about paint brushes. So we're going to be doing some work with a flat brush. This is a flat brush. As you can see, it's just flat across the top. This is a 1-inch brush. We're going to be using it for covering wide surfaces. This brush is a round watercolor brush. This one is also. This round watercolor brush is a number 10. It's made by Princeton. It's their Heritage series. The number 10 refers to the size of the brush. So like this is a number 2. It's a different brand, so the sizing is going to be a little bit inconsistent. So these are the two brushes I use primarily for just about all my paintings. So you don't need to invest a lot of money in a lot of different brushes, although some of them are very fun. You can get a lot done with a really good round brush, and a good round brush is one that comes to a point, and yeah, get everything done with those. Okay, so we got flat brush, 2 round brushes, and then I use just a HB pencil and a kneaded eraser. And a kneaded eraser is good to use on watercolor paper because it doesn't ruin the surface of the paper. You're able to just lift up the graphite from the paper easily with this. And this is a nice lightweight pencil, so you're not making really dark marks when you're drawing your subject ahead of time. Then I keep either a paper towel or tissue or a rag to blot off my brush in between colors, or to get excess water or excess paint off my brush. So have that nearby. And lastly, I just have a big jar of water that I use to activate my paints. And lastly, most importantly, let's talk about the paint. So this is my watercolor palette that I use on a daily basis. And as you can see, it's just set up in terms of colors. I have my greens, yellows, oranges, some golds, my reds, into some magenta, purples, blues, black, and Payne's gray and sepia. So then I have a few random colors in here that I didn't have a spot for. And then I use the space in between, as you can see, for mixing. So I just did a painting where I had to mix a color for a rose, and this is the space I used to do that in. So this is an inexpensive palette. It does have a cover on it, so I can protect my paint from, you know, dust or hair or whatever that might get into it. Maybe you have a pet and you don't want cat hair in your paint. So there's a cover that goes on it. And did not spend a lot of money on this. It is plastic, and it's just really versatile. It's not too big, but big enough to hold the paints that I typically paint with. If you don't want to invest in something like that, you could just go to Michael's and get a simple little palette like this. It's just a plastic palette. It also comes with a little plastic cover. You can put your paints around it, and I have a space here in the center that I can clean off and mix my paints in here. Mix my paints in that center area. That's all you have to do. Okay. So that's a real simple solution. Okay, so we have your paper, your paint, your brushes, pencil, a rag to wipe your brush off with, water, you know, all those things if you can gather that. If you don't have the exact paints that I have, I'm not even going to list them because I don't want you to feel pressure to have those certain colors. If you have primary colors, which are the red, yellow, and blue, you can mix just about any color that you need, so you can go with that, but we will talk more about that as we go along. So next, let's start putting some brushes into the paint and seeing what each tool does. Okay, let's do that next. All right, we've talked about the different supplies I recommend. Now let's practice using some of those supplies. Well, obviously we'll be doing that this whole course, but let's just jump in. We've got white paper. I know it's a little bit intimidating. This for me is just a piece of scrap paper, part of what was left over from a painting that I didn't use. And I'm just putting my brush right into the water, okay? And I'm going to put some water in some of my paints because they've been sitting out and they dried up and they need to be kind of brought to life. If you don't have a squirt bottle, you could just use water on your brush like this. Just put some water in there. Okay. And so that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to get some water on my brush, put it into my paint, really get a lot of paint on my brush. Okay. I don't want it dripping off, so I'm wiping off on the edge there, but you can see that there's a lot of pigment, a lot of color there on my brush. So one thing I'd like to have you do, practice brush strokes, okay? So just put the tip of your brush onto the paper and pull that across. Trying to apply very, very light pressure, so much so that it's coming off the page. Okay, so it's a really light pressure with the brush. Now, I'm gonna go back in, put some more paint on my brush. I'm gonna make really hard pressure on my brush. Okay. So, I have a little clump of paint there that didn't get diluted. Okay, now I'm going to do that same thing, but I'm going to add a little more water to my brush. So I'm going to have tons of water, and it flows a lot easier. Let's do tons of water here again. Flows a lot nicer. Okay, so that's two things you could do already with your round brush. practicing using a really light touch to get a fine line, and then pushing the whole belly of the brush onto the paper to get a thicker line. Also varying the amount of water that's on your brush. So, I've done that. I'm going to go back into my paint again. Make sure I have enough water on my brush because I like it when it flows nicely. And this time I'm going to combine the two strokes. So I'm going to combine that really light stroke, and then I'm going to press down and you get a little thicker, and then I'm going to lighten it up. When I say lighten it up, I mean the amount of pressure I'm putting on the brush onto the paper. So not much pressure, a lot of pressure, then pulling up on that pressure. So you can see how that might make a leaf or maybe a petal. Let's do this right next to it. Do another one right next to it. Ooh, we have a little red leaf there, don't we? So we can attach that. There we go. So really good practice to do these singly, just practicing painting a thin line so that you're controlling how much pressure you use, practicing a thicker line, and making sure you're thinking about how much paint's on your brush, and then combining the two. So thin pressure, light pressure, and more pressure, then bringing it back up, okay? So let's try that, okay? All right, that's one thing to practice with your round brush. Let's grab your flat brush, okay? And a flat brush is used just a little bit differently, but it's pretty fun to use. All right, now I have my flat brush, and I'm going to get it wet, and I'm going to load it with color. So I'm just grabbing this purple color. Now, if you don't have that, no big deal. Use your red, use your blue, yellow, Payne's gray, anything. This is one I just want to demonstrate with. All right, so lots of intense color on my brush. Good amount of water. And let me show you some of the strokes you can make with this. So obviously just a simple straight line. Now I can make that all the same value by just moving the paint around and the water around. And I have a nice flat value there, okay? Or a flat wash, okay? So when you fill up with space with the same value of a color, it's called a flat wash. All right. Now, I'm going to take that same dark, intense color. I'm going to wipe my brush off on my rag, grab some water, blot that a little bit too, and kind of grab the bottom of that first line of paint, wipe my brush off, get some water, dab that off. And now, as you can see, I'm kind of basically doing another value scale in a larger format, but this is a graded wash. So I would use a graded wash for maybe a sky. And then I might grab, I'm going to grab a facial tissue here. And while my paint is wet, I'm going to take some paint out. And I might do that you know, for clouds or just for a certain effect in a background. So I lifted paint with a tissue. Okay. So we've got the flat wash with the flat brush now, and then the graded wash, and then the lifting. Now the other thing I can do is use my flat brush. I'm putting it right into very intense color. So I'm putting it kind of right on that hardened paint. But I know there's water. I can see there's water in there. I put water in there. So that paint's been activated. And this is another way I can use this brush. I can use it like this. I could just use the edge. And there are times when I've used this, you know, maybe I have a fence post that I really need to have a straight edge and it's a certain size, I could use that. You could also, you know, paint like this with it. You know, getting some variation in your size of your strokes. Really, that's about it. So, I mean, if you want to use the flat edge of it, just depends on how much water is on your brush, okay? So those are all the things you can do with this flat brush. Other thing that you can do with your round brush, just loading it up with a lot of paint, is you can splatter paint. Okay, that's kind of a fun thing to do. Really important thing you're going to see me do a lot is lifting color out of things with a wet brush. So this is just my brush, and I've cleaned it off, and I've put it in the water, and now I'm going to dab it off on my rag. So now it's called a thirsty brush, and I'm going to go right in here, and I'm going to lift out some paint. Wipe it off on my rag. Dry my brush on my rag again. And that's a really important thing to be able to do because, I mean, you just will use it. So here you can see it really vividly. Here, these strokes that I put down with the edge of the flat brush, I could just soak up some extra water that's on there just by touching it. And all of that water and some pigment go right into my brush. So just lighten that right up. Okay, so those are all really important things you practice with how to use this. Just play around it. Just give yourself permission to make some strokes, see what your brush will do, see if you can manipulate it, and you know, have some fun with it. If you just make some strokes with it like that, if you paint like this, that, just have some fun and get to know your brushes by just putting some paint on paper. All right, great.